From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Primary voters go to the polls for the final time in 2022. What's on the ballot today? And a new consumer prices report shows inflation looking a little bit intransitive. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Mene Ukwe-Barua. Welcome to you both. So the big race today in the primaries, to my eye, is in New Hampshire, the Senate race. And on the Republican side, you have a pretty establishment candidate, Chuck Morse, who's the president of the New Hampshire Senate. And he's running against a retired General Don Bolduc. And this is one of those races, again, where Democrats are putting money into the Republican primary, trying to influence how Republican voters are going to choose their nominee. Kim, can you give us a sense of what's going on here?
Yeah, so the Dan Bolduc candidate, as you mentioned, is certainly more on the fringy side. A couple of comments he has made, for instance, says that he is called Chris Sununu, who is the very popular governor in New Hampshire. He's called him a Chinese communist sympathizer. He has stood up and insisted that Donald Trump did win the last election. And again, you can go out and you can say that there was a lot of funny business with regard to all the changes in voting patterns. But to say that Joe Biden isn't the president, that's a little bit different. So there's that. And he's running against a guy who is much more of a mainstream Republican candidate named Chuck Morse. And what you've got is groups like Chuck Schumer's Senate Majority PAC spending millions attacking Morse because they'd like to have Bolduc on the ballot because they think he'd be easier to beat in a general election. They've got an ad up, for instance, saying Mitch McConnell's Washington establishment is going all in for Chuck Morse. So really trying to undermine him. Now, this has led to finally in the press some real questions about how can Joe Biden go out on one hand and claim that some of these fringe candidates are so dangerous to democracy when Democrats are out supporting them, essentially helping them to potentially be in a position where they could win. That hasn't stopped Democrats from doing it. Now, the one thing I would say is that sort of like what we saw in Missouri when Republicans got very nervous about the potential that Eric Greitens, the former governor who was dogged by a lot of scandals, might win. They all came together, put a lot of money in, and ended up getting a different and better candidate in Missouri. You see something like this happening in New Hampshire, a group called the White Mountain PAC over the last 2 weeks who spent $5 million supporting Chuck Morse. It's really unclear. There hasn't been a ton of polling, but we'll see how this all turns out later tonight.
But the polling, I think, is part of what has Republicans worried here, and there hasn't been a whole lot of it. But there's one poll from late August that shows Bolduc up by about 20 points. And so there has been an attempt by more centrist establishment, whatever word you want to use, mainstream Republicans to kind of rally to Chuck Morse here. And I think that just to underline what Kim said, some of the fringe views that Bolduc has expressed, here's a local news report in something called the Manchester Ink Link, and I'll read a few lines of it. This is from 2020 and concerns COVID vaccines. And the report says, in a YouTube video, Bolduc made reference to his supposed plan to implant some sort of tracking microchips into people. Quote, the only bracelets anyone is going to put on me are handcuffs because I'm fighting for my individual rights, my constitutional rights, and the only chip that's going in me is a Dorito, Bolduc said in the May video. When asked about the microchip statement, Bolduc said Bill Gates, retired founder of Microsoft, wants to implant people with tracking microchips. Quote, this is Bill Gates saying we should put chips inside people now. That's a dangerous violation of my constitutional right, Bolduc said. And that's where I will leave that report. And I had never heard of the Manchester Ink Link. I am assured by a New Hampshireite with knowledge of the news business that it's a real straight news source, a local news website. And so there's not really any reason to doubt that this took place, even though I haven't seen this YouTube video and haven't been able to find it myself. But Mene, I mean, that's the thing about conspiracy theorists is there's rarely a single issue conspiracy theorist. And I guess 2 points I would make. One is that this seems like a opposition research bonanza for the Democratic incumbent senator, Maggie Hassan, who could be vulnerable if Morse gets the nomination here. And two, as Kim says, Bolduc has also made statements about thinking that voting machines were flipping votes unfairly in 2020. And we've heard Democrats talk about how election denialism, as they put it, is a threat to democracy, a threat to the republic. And yet here they are again, putting their money to help a candidate who thinks the 2020 election was stolen get the Republican Party nomination.
Right. I mean, I think there's no doubt that Maggie Hassan is going to be flogging all of those details that you just mentioned and whatever else they're able to dig up on Bolduc if he does get the nomination. It's very clear that New Hampshire is to some degree still a swingable state. Everyone considered this Senate race to be potentially in play, particularly if Governor Sununu, as you mentioned, who's very popular, had decided to run. Democrats have had a polling advantage for quite some time, and I believe it's shifted a little bit in Hassan's direction along with the national trend that we've seen of Democrats regaining a little bit of ground in these midterms. But still, this is a race that theoretically could have been winnable and where candidate quality from the Republican nominee was going to matter a lot. And so it does seem very likely that the kinds of moderate, persuadable voters who theoretically could have gone for a Republican to sort of put a check on Joe Biden are going to probably be pretty easily persuaded to rally around Maggie Hassan if she is able to sort of get some of Bolduc's more loony positions out into the airwaves. But I do think that polling advantage that Bolduc has over Morse is an interesting reflection, again, of the impact that President Trump has had over Republican primary voters throughout the entire course of this primary season. And it's funny to remember at this point that months ago, we were all wondering, how much Trump's influence really would matter. There were a lot of signs that the party was moving on. If you looked at some of these candidate straw polls for 2024, you saw DeSantis and some of the other alternatives rising, Trump kind of receding, but he really did manage to come back with a vengeance. And you had candidates who rose very sharply in the primary polls after they received Trump's endorsement. That was true in Ohio, that was true in Arizona with the Senate nominees there. And I think it's interesting to note that Bolduc in New Hampshire, I don't believe actually has Trump's explicit endorsement. Either of you could correct me if I'm wrong about that, but I think in his case, it was enough just to signal how aligned he was with the sort of election conspiracy claims to basically be running from that vantage point of wanting to go to Washington to basically make the case that the 2020 election was stolen. And there are a lot of primary voters who have gravitated to him within the Republican Party merely for that message. So it is kind of a closing statement about Trump's influence over these primaries.
Kim, what else is on the ballot today that listeners should be watching for as the primary election returns come in tonight?
Sure. There's also 2 House seats in play in New Hampshire. One that really could be a GOP pickup opportunity is in the 1st district, where Chris Pappas is the Democratic incumbent, but it's a very close district. So Republicans are having a primary there, which has come down to really a race between 2 candidates, even though there's more than that in the race. One is Matt Mowers. He worked in the Trump State Department, and he has the endorsement of everyone from Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader in the House, to Steve Scalise, his second in command. He's running against a woman named Carolyn Levitt, who's running as much more a Trumpian candidate. And she, for instance, has the support of Elise Stefanik, but they go back a ways, work together. So this will be interesting to see who comes out on top. There's also one for the 2nd district where 7 candidates are running in the Republican primary to challenge another Democratic incumbent, Annie Kuster. She's been there for 5 terms. She could be a little bit harder to knock off, although she's still a little vulnerable. And this is more of a scrum. One of the names to watch is a guy named George Handel. He's a businessman and former mayor, only because Chris Sununu, the governor, endorsed him, and that's going to help him a bit.
And these are the last primaries of 2022, so maybe we should take a step back and look at some of the themes emerging. And one of them, as Monet was referring to, is candidate quality and President Trump's endorsement record. And Senator Tim Scott was asked about this on Fox News Sunday, and I thought he had an interesting reply. So let's listen to this.
Well, the players are on the field. We are 8 weeks away, which is kind of like saying we're in the last 2 minutes of the 4th quarter. So the truth is who we have on the field is who we're going to play. I'm excited about the candidates that we have overall because I do believe it gives us the opportunity to win back the majority and to return sanity in Washington, which will reverberate around the country.
Monet, I take Tim Scott's point there that we're 8 weeks from the election and the people on the field are the people that are going to be running. On the other hand, I do think that there's 2 aspects to President Trump's endorsement record, and we can right now go through and look at his primary success, which candidates in primaries he endorsed actually won those primaries. And there were some wins and some losses, but the other side of that is how those candidates fare in November. And I think people need to keep that in mind when they're talking about Trump's endorsement record. Is the other half of it that the part that really matters to taking back the House and the Senate, the jury's still out on that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think there certainly is no doubt at this point that Trump exerts a lot of influence over the party, both direct in the cases of the candidates who he endorses directly and indirect, just in the sense that it is very important to Republican primary voters that candidates show that, they believe in President Trump's legacy and in some cases his election conspiracy claims. So that has been a big factor in these outcomes, probably bigger than most analysts would have guessed before primary season began. But now, after tonight, we're going to be shifting in a different direction, and these candidates are going to be facing general elections and have to make their case to sort of a moderate center in order to build majorities and actually get elected. And the polls seem to suggest that a lot of these candidates are underperforming the generic ballot and underperforming what people thought, given that 2022 is generally a Republican year and that people are so dissatisfied with President Biden's performance. I do think that there's certainly reason for hope, kind of along the lines that Tim Scott was suggesting. These candidates, first of all, know their mandate, and you're already seeing some of them start to soften their message and image. That's been particularly true in Arizona with Blake Masters, who ran as kind of somewhat of a smash-mouth, Trump-aligned candidate, but particularly has been moderating his stance on abortion, as that has become one of the most important issues that voters are facing and has negatively affected a lot of Republican polling around the country. So I expect that you're going to see a lot more of that, not just on the abortion issue, but generally people trying to present a friendlier face. But in general, I do think that it's difficult to really gauge beforehand how general electorates are going to respond to candidates who might seem quirky to the media. It's funny, we're talking about New Hampshire today, and I can think back to 2010 when I cast my first ever vote for Kelly Ayotte for the New Hampshire Senate. And she was part of this Tea Party wave. And I think a lot of people on the conservative side probably had the same worries about some of the candidates who were being nominated in 2010. They're a little bit too extreme ideologically. They're, staking out these very kind of harsh anti-Obama messages. Is that going to turn off swing voters? But it ended up being a really significant Republican wave year nonetheless. And there were a lot of candidates who, swept into Washington kind of despite media doubts. And so we're going to have to see. We'll get new rounds of polling soon and see how these candidates actually are stacking up against the competition.